My name is Daniel Marsh, and for 11 months, a woman named Carol Denning made it her personal mission to destroy my life one tow truck at a time. She was the president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, and she ruled our little slice of suburbia like a queen who had never once been told no. By the time this story ends, I will have taken something from her that she valued far more than any parking spot. But let's start at the beginning, because you need to understand exactly how far she pushed before I pushed back. I bought my house on Sycamore Lane 3 years ago. It was a modest 4-bedroom in a decent neighborhood, close to my daughter's school, close to my job managing logistics for a regional trucking company. The house came with an HOA, which I didn't love, but I figured as long as I mowed my lawn and paid my dues, I'd never have to think about it. I was wrong. The truck in question was a 2019 Ford F250, dark blue. The kind of vehicle a man needs when he's got a boat, a camper, and a habit of helping his brother-in-law move furniture on weekends. It was registered, insured, and completely legal to park in my own driveway. That should have been the end of the story. It was not. Carol Denning lived 4 houses down, in a colonial with white shutters and a lawn so manicured it looked photoshopped. She had been HOA president for 6 years, and in that time she had developed a reputation. Ask anyone on Sycamore Lane about Carol, and you'd hear the same word over and over. Control. She controlled paint colors, controlled mailbox styles, controlled how long your holiday lights could stay up in January. And apparently she had decided that my truck, sitting quietly in my own driveway, was an affront to the aesthetic integrity of Willowbrook Estates. The first tow happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I walked outside with my coffee, ready to head to work, and my driveway was empty. Just an oil stain and a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. I called the police first, thinking it had been stolen. They told me it had been towed at the request of the HOA, citing a bylaw about commercial-style vehicles parked in residential driveways. My truck was not a commercial vehicle, it was a personal pickup truck, but the bylaw was vague enough that Carol had decided it applied to me. $280 to get it out of impound. I paid it, annoyed but not yet furious, and I went to the next HOA meeting to sort it out like a reasonable adult. That was my first mistake. I thought Carol wanted a conversation. She wanted a battlefield. At the meeting, held in the clubhouse that smelled permanently of stale coffee and printer toner, I raised my hand and asked politely why my truck had been towed when it met every parking requirement in the covenant. Carol smiled at me the way you'd smile at a child who just said something cute and wrong. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "trucks of that size create a visual disruption to the neighborhood's character. We've had complaints." I asked who had complained. She said that was confidential. I asked to see the specific bylaw. She said the board would review it internally. I left that meeting with nothing but a headache and a growing suspicion that reasoning with Carol Denning was like trying to negotiate with a brick wall that had strong opinions about lawn ornaments. The second tow came 3 weeks later, then the third, 2 weeks after that. By June, I had been towed 6 times. I started keeping a folder, receipts, timestamps, photos of my truck parked perfectly within the lines of my own driveway, not blocking a sidewalk, not touching the street, not violating a single reasonable rule. Every single time the tow company cited HOA authorization, and every single time that authorization traced back to one signature, Carol Denning. I want to be clear about something. This wasn't about a truck, not really. This was about a woman who had discovered that she had a small kingdom, and I was the one resident who wouldn't bow to it. My neighbor Frank told me, over a beer on his porch, that Carol had done something similar to the Ramirez family 2 years before I moved in, towing their van repeatedly until they eventually sold their house and moved to a different subdivision entirely. Frank said it in a hushed voice, like he was telling me a ghost story. Looking back, he probably was. By tow number 8, I had lost over $2,000 in impound fees. I had missed a morning shift because I had no vehicle to get to the depot. My daughter Ellie, who was 9 at the time, had started asking why the truck lady kept taking my truck away, like Carol was some kind of recurring villain in her bedtime stories. In a way, she was. Somewhere around tow number 5, I started noticing a pattern that made the whole thing feel even more personal. The tows never happened on random days. They happened right before something important. Tow number 4 landed the morning of a work presentation I had been preparing for weeks. Tow number 6 happened the day before a long weekend I had planned to take Ellie camping, forcing me to cancel because I couldn't rent a truck on short notice that could tow our little trailer. It was almost as if Carol had a calendar of my life and was circling the worst possible moments to strike. I later learned, from a neighbor who used to babysit for the Denning family years earlier, that Carol kept detailed notes on every resident's comings and goings, ostensibly for security purposes. I don't know if that's true, but by that point, I wouldn't have been surprised. I tried for a while simply parking on the street instead of my driveway, thinking it might avoid the entire issue. Carol found a way to have that towed too, citing a separate bylaw about overnight street parking that, as far as I could tell, had never been enforced against anyone else on Sycamore Lane. When I brought this up at the next meeting, board member after board member shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware that the enforcement was selective, but nobody was willing to challenge Carol directly. She had been president for 6 years. She knew where every skeleton in every closet in that neighborhood was buried, and people were afraid of what she might dig up if they crossed her. I even tried appealing to her sense of neighborliness directly, showing up at her door one Saturday afternoon with a plate of cookies my wife had baked, hoping a small gesture of goodwill might soften things. Carol accepted the cookies with a polite smile, thanked me, and then, not 20 minutes later, I watched from my window as a tow truck rolled slowly down Sycamore Lane, heading straight for my driveway. That was tow number 7. I never tried the cookie approach again. I tried everything reasonable. I sent certified letters requesting a copy of the exact bylaw being enforced. I attended 3 more HOA meetings. I even offered, in front of the entire board, to move my truck into the garage permanently if that would resolve the issue, even though the covenant clearly allowed driveway parking for personal vehicles under a certain size, and my truck fell within that size. Carol rejected the compromise without explanation. She didn't want a solution. She wanted compliance, and more than that, I think she wanted to watch me lose. Tow number 9 happened during a week when Ellie had a school project due, and I needed the truck to haul the poster board and supplies from the craft store. Tow number 10 happened the morning of my father's memorial service, when I was already running on fumes, grief-stricken, and running late, and I walked outside to find an empty driveway again. That was the day something shifted in me. Not rage. Rage is loud and messy, and it burns out. What I felt was colder than that. It was resolve. I stopped trying to reason with Carol Denning through polite letters and board meetings. I started doing something else entirely. I started researching her. Here's the thing about people who spend that much energy controlling everyone around them. They rarely have the same energy left over to manage their own affairs. I began pulling public records, the same way I would if I were doing due diligence on a business deal. Property records are public. Court filings are public. Tax records in most states are public. I wasn't hacking anything, I wasn't breaking any laws. I was reading documents that anyone could walk into the county clerk's office and request. What I found took me 3 weeks to piece together, and when I finally understood the full picture, I actually laughed out loud in my kitchen, alone, at 11 at night. Carol Denning's house, the colonial with the white shutters, the house she had lived in for over a decade, the house from which she ran her tiny, tyrannical empire, was in serious financial trouble. She had taken out a home equity line of credit 4 years earlier, apparently to cover a legal settlement from an unrelated dispute with a former business partner. She had fallen behind on the property taxes for 2 consecutive years. In our county, when property taxes go unpaid long enough, the county doesn't just quietly wait. It sells the delinquent tax debt as a tax lien certificate through a public auction, open to any resident or investor willing to pay off the debt in exchange for the right to collect it back, with interest from the homeowner. If the homeowner doesn't repay within the statutory redemption period, the lien holder can eventually petition the court to foreclose and take title to the property. I am not a lawyer. I want to say that clearly because this story only works if you understand that I did nothing illegal, nothing underhanded, nothing that any other citizen couldn't have done. I simply paid attention to a process that already existed, a process my own county had been running publicly for decades. A process Carol herself would have known about if she'd spent half as much time managing her own finances as she spent managing my parking situation. I called my cousin Marissa, who works in real estate law 2 counties over, and I asked her to walk me through exactly how tax lien certificates worked in our state. She confirmed everything I'd read. The county held quarterly lien auctions. Anyone could register, anyone could bid, and the debt itself, Carol's unpaid property taxes, was going to be auctioned off in 11 weeks. Marissa also warned me about a few things I hadn't considered. She explained that holding a lien certificate wasn't the same as owning the property outright, and that foreclosure was a genuine last resort, not a guarantee. Most lien holders, she said, never actually end up taking a home. The vast majority of homeowners find a way to redeem their debt before the window closes, because the interest rates on redemption are steep enough to motivate quick repayment, and because losing your home over unpaid taxes is such a serious consequence that most people scramble to avoid it the moment they receive formal notice. She told me that if my actual goal was to take Carol's house, I'd likely be disappointed because, statistically, that almost never happens. If my goal was to make her feel the same powerlessness she'd inflicted on me, however, this would do exactly that, and do it entirely within the boundaries of the law. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't trying to be a villain in someone else's story. I wanted accountability, not destruction. Marissa's explanation actually made me feel more comfortable moving forward, because it meant the process itself had built-in fairness. Carol would get every legal protection afforded to any other homeowner in her position. She just also, for the first time in years, wouldn't be the one writing the rules. I want to pause here and say something important. I did not do this the moment I found out. I sat with it for several days. I genuinely asked myself whether this was fair, whether it was proportionate, whether I was about to become the very thing I hated in Carol, someone who used technical rules to crush another person's life. I thought about it during my morning drives, during Ellie's soccer practice, during the quiet hours after she went to bed. But then, tow number 11 happened. This time, Carol had the truck towed while my elderly mother was staying with us and needed a ride to a cardiology appointment. I had to call a rideshare, and the appointment ran late, and my mother sat in a waiting room for 40 extra minutes because a woman 4 houses down had decided that my truck offended her sense of neighborhood order. That was the moment my hesitation ended. I registered for the county tax lien auction under my own name. No tricks, no hidden entities. I did my research on exactly which parcel number corresponded to Carol's address, cross-referencing it 3 times to make absolutely sure I had the correct property. I set aside the money, just over $11,000, which covered 2 years of delinquent taxes, penalties, and administrative fees. It was almost exactly what I had lost, cumulatively, in tow fees, missed work, rideshare costs, and the sheer emotional toll of watching my daughter flinch every time she heard a tow truck's engine on our street. The auction took place on a Thursday morning in the county administration building, a beige room with folding chairs and a projector that didn't quite reach the back wall. There were maybe 15 other people there, mostly professional investors who did this for a living. Men and women in polo shirts scrolling through spreadsheets on their phones between lots. When Carol's parcel came up, I raised my paddle. Nobody else bid. Small residential liens rarely attracted competition from the professionals, who preferred larger commercial properties. I won the certificate for the exact amount owed. That evening, I got the 12th tow. I remember standing in my driveway, staring at the empty concrete, and instead of feeling the familiar surge of anger, I felt almost peaceful. I already knew what I was going to do next. I went inside, kissed Ellie goodnight, and started reading through the redemption period requirements one more time, just to be certain I understood every step. In our state, once you hold a tax lien certificate, the homeowner has a redemption period, in this case 2 years from the date of the original delinquency, which meant Carol actually had roughly 5 months left before that window closed entirely. During that time, she had every opportunity to pay off her back taxes, plus the interest that had accrued, and reclaim the certificate. County law required that lien holders send formal notice to the property owner, so this was never a secret trap. It was a legal process with built-in warnings at every stage. I sent the first notice by certified mail exactly as the statute required, informing Carol Denning that her property taxes on record had been sold as a lien certificate, and that she had a defined period to redeem the debt before foreclosure proceedings could be initiated. I did not sign it with any personal message. I didn't need to. The county's official letterhead did the talking for me. 3 days later, Carol showed up at my door. I want to describe her face in that moment because it is one of the most satisfying things I have ever witnessed. She was pale, her hands trembling slightly around the envelope, and for the first time in 11 months, she did not look like a queen surveying her kingdom. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been so consumed with controlling her neighbors that she had let her own house crumble underneath her. "Is this a joke?" she asked. "No," I said. "It's public record. You can verify it with the county clerk yourself." "You did this," she said, her voice rising. "You did this to get back at me." I didn't deny it. Why would I? "You towed my truck 12 times," I said. "You towed it during my father's memorial. You towed it while my mother needed a ride to her cardiology appointment. I tried to talk to you like a reasonable neighbor for almost a year. This isn't revenge, Carol. This is what happens when you ignore your own responsibilities long enough. I just happened to notice." She threatened to sue. She threatened to call the police. She threatened to have the entire HOA board investigate me for harassment, which was almost funny considering the actual paper trail of harassment ran entirely in the opposite direction. Her lawyer, when she eventually hired one, confirmed within a week that the lien was completely valid, purchased through the proper legal channel, and that her only real path forward was to pay off the debt before the redemption period expired. Here's where I have to be honest with you, because this story only matters if it's true to how these things actually work. I did not want to take her house. That was never really my goal. My goal, deep down, was for her to feel, just once, the same helplessness I had felt standing in my empty driveway for the 12th time. I wanted her to understand what it was like to have something significant hang in the balance because of a decision someone else made about her life without her input. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like Willowbrook Estates, and within 2 weeks, most of Sycamore Lane knew what had happened. I didn't tell anyone myself. I assume it came from Carol's own lawyer, or perhaps from a clerk at the county office who mentioned it to the wrong person at the wrong dinner party. Reactions were mixed. A few neighbors, including Frank, thought I had gone too far, arguing that 2 wrongs don't make a right, and that I should have simply let the HOA's internal politics run their course. Others, particularly the families who had quietly complained about Carol's overreach for years but never had the courage to challenge her directly, treated me almost like a folk hero. The Ramirez family's old neighbors told me they wished someone had done something similar years earlier, before the Ramirezes gave up and sold their house at a loss just to escape Carol's constant scrutiny. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had simply refused to keep absorbing damage indefinitely. There's a difference between fighting back and seeking destruction, and I tried very hard to stay on the right side of that line throughout the entire process. I never spoke publicly about the lien until Carol herself brought it up at a hastily called HOA meeting, where she accused me, in front of the entire board, of orchestrating a personal vendetta. I simply stood up and asked the board secretary to pull the county's public auction records, which confirmed everything I had already told her privately. This was an open auction, publicized in advance, available to any resident who cared to attend. Nobody said another word about it that night. Carol had 5 months. She spent the first 6 weeks in denial, consulting lawyers who all told her the same thing. She spent the next several weeks trying to negotiate directly with me, offering to forgive the outstanding fines she claimed I owed the HOA in some kind of trade, as if unpaid tow-related fines and a legally purchased tax lien were even remotely equivalent. I declined. This was never about fines. It was about a legal debt she had allowed to snowball for 2 years while she was busy micromanaging her neighbors' driveways. In the end, Carol scraped together the funds. She sold a piece of jewelry, took out a small personal loan, and paid off the lien plus interest 3 weeks before the redemption period closed. I received my money back, plus the statutory interest the law entitled me to, which came out to a little over $4,000 in profit. I want to be clear that the profit was never the point. The point was that for the first time in almost a year, Carol Denning understood exactly what it felt like to lose control of something she valued, through no fault but her own mismanagement. She resigned as HOA president 2 months later. I heard through Frank that the new board quietly repealed the vague, commercial-style vehicle bylaw entirely, replacing it with clear, specific language about vehicle dimensions that any reasonable truck owner could easily meet. My truck has not been towed once since Carol stepped down. I saw her a handful of times after that, mostly from a distance, watering her rose bushes or walking to her mailbox. She never apologized, not directly, though once, in the grocery store parking lot, she nodded at me in a way that felt less like acknowledgement and more like a quiet concession. I nodded back. We haven't spoken since, and honestly, we don't need to. Ellie is 12 now. She still occasionally jokes about the truck lady, though the fear in her voice has long since turned into something closer to amusement, the way old family stories eventually do. My mother made it to all of her cardiology appointments after that, on time, in the truck that finally, permanently stayed parked exactly where it belonged. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story, whether I regret how far things went, whether buying that lien crossed a line. I've thought about it a lot, and here's where I've landed. I never once broke a law, never once lied, Never once did anything Carol herself couldn't have done to protect her own house if she'd simply paid attention to her responsibilities the way she expected everyone else on Sycamore Lane to pay attention to theirs. I gave her every legal notice the county required. I gave her months to fix the situation herself. She had every opportunity to avoid the outcome, right up until the very end. What I learned from all of this is something simple, but it took me 11 toes and a small fortune in fees to fully understand it. Power that isn't checked by anything eventually convinces itself it's untouchable. Carol Denning ran Willowbrook Estates like her personal domain because, for 6 years, nobody had ever shown her that rules apply to everyone, including the person enforcing them. She spent so much energy controlling the small, visible things in her neighbors' lives, a truck, a mailbox, a string of holiday lights, that she completely lost sight of the much bigger, much quieter responsibility sitting in her own name at the county courthouse. I don't say any of this with pride exactly. There's no version of this story where I feel triumphant in some cinematic way. Mostly, I just feel a kind of tired relief. The same relief you feel when you finally set down something heavy you've been carrying for far too long. My driveway is quiet now. My daughter sleeps soundly. My truck sits exactly where it's supposed to, and nobody comes to take it away in the middle of the night anymore. Sometimes the neighborhood kids ask Ellie if it's true, the story about the HOA lady and the truck and the house. Ellie just smiles and says, "Yeah, my dad doesn't like being pushed around, especially not 12 times." And honestly, that's about the most accurate summary anyone could give.